Welcome and thanks for joining for this week's short devotional. This week, I want to look at Psalm 73, and specifically, we're just going to look at a couple verses in Psalm 73. I want to title this short message, if you will, The Strength of My Life. The Strength of My Life. Now, we've talked a lot, and in Psalms, as we've looked through the Psalms so far up to this point, David has written a lot of the Psalms up to this point. And he's talked about how he's been in tough places, tough things going on, how God delivers him, God provides life to him, all these different things, messages about looking to God in the storms of life, all these different sorts of things. I want to continue a little bit of that trend. The Psalms will end a lot with praise as we get closer to the end of different things we find praiseworthy. There's a lot in each one of these Psalms that are praiseworthy about God. But today there's specifically three verses that I want to take a look at, and it's verses 26 through 28 of Psalm chapter 73. And really the setup to this in Psalm 73, we see that this psalm is a psalm of Asaph. Now, Asaph works in the temple, and he's one of the ones that works as one of the singers, kind of leader in the temple, if you will, in that capacity. Many different areas in which we see him making different statements about God in the Psalms that he wrote throughout the book of Psalm. And really, there's a ton of encouragement in there. But in Psalm 73, we see Asaph do a song of comparison. And he does a song of comparison, contrasting and comparing those of wickedness and those that are desiring and pursuers of God. And back several years ago, I was going through a hard season of life. And physically speaking, not just spiritually, but physically speaking, for me to not just get out of bed, but to even just go about my day and perform different tasks was incredibly draining physically. To put one foot in front of the other was very, very difficult. It almost seemed like it was going to be impossible to make it through any given day, physically speaking. And not just spiritually. Spiritually, that was another level of just struggling and knowing, God, I know you've got me, but I'm just struggling to make it through any given day, let alone one day. Stop thinking about tomorrow. I'm struggling getting through today. And really, there's a big part of Psalm 73 that speaks to this from the Song of Asaph. And the psalmist, Asaph, takes refuge in God for each day in particular, not looking ahead to the day, but in the moments of each day that fill that day with all of its struggles, its pains, its toiling, everything that goes on. And I'm sure each and every one of us have been there. Kind of a funny story. But about, let's see here, I think it would have been about 7 years ago now, 7 years ago, my wife and I enlisted into a half marathon. And I say enlisted because it sounds like a military program. To me, running a half marathon is like a military program. My wife, she enjoyed it much more than I did. But we ran together for this half marathon. And just so you know, yes, we did finish this half marathon. Although I have to say, sadly, sorry guys, my wife had to drag me across the finish line. I was struggling to make it every step. About 3/4 of the way through, I was struggling to take the next step. And my wife was actually right there with me, encouraging me, and even at times just grabbed my hand saying, come on, let's go. She's just right there. She wasn't letting me stop. And in a real way, I was struggling to take the next step, and then the next step, and the next step. But by the grace of God, each of those steps did happen, although with pain, each of those steps did happen. And at some specific point in the long out future, I did finish that race. And it's amazing how the Christian life, and really ultimately life as a whole, can be a lot like that. So let's just take a look at verses 26 to 28 here real quick, and we'll talk about them. This is what Asaph writes in verse 26. My flesh and my heart may fail. And again, this has a lot of physical aspect to it. My God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. And so just to take a look at verse 26 right away, Asaph acknowledges failing and ailing of heart and flesh, like our physical bodies, that they're struggling sometimes to just press on, to be used in any capacity, and to walk towards God and godliness in any capacity. Sometimes it's a real physical battle. And so Asaph acknowledges that. I think it's really important to hear the second stage, though, here. He says, "But God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever." And so sometimes when we read this in English, people ask the question, so then is God struggling then? If for some reason my flesh and my heart are failing, but God is the strength of them, then is he failing? And no, that's not what this text is saying. That's not it at all. Matter of fact, what it's saying is the outer body of who we are has struggles, and it has pains and sufferings and difficulties of all different sorts to just make it through the course of a day. But we can count on the fact that what it takes to accomplish that given day, God will see us through it. He has the strength necessary to take us through each and every day that he gives us. That there will not be an actual failing. There may be a sort of pain and agony and suffering and trial that goes through life, but ultimately God is going to carry those that lean and trust on him. He is going to make sure that physically speaking, they make it through the course of the day. See, God knows not just our spiritual need, but he knows our physical need as well. And so he gives exactly what's necessary. And a lot of times people take this today and they'll say, well, you've been so busy. You need to go off and you need to go find some vacation place to just go off and rest. But the reality is that there's people all over the globe that they don't get an opportunity to go out and take a rest like that. And so they have to lean on this promise that God is going to provide for them, physically speaking, today, right here and now, to be able to make it through. It may be with incredible difficulty, but God nonetheless will give them exactly what's necessary to walk through that day if they will remain trusting and resting on him alone. A few passages that go with this, Isaiah chapter 40 and 28 to 30. This is what it says in verses 28 to 30 of Isaiah chapter 40. You may have heard these before. I encourage you to just listen to them and encourage them. Do you not know? Have you not heard? The everlasting God, the Lord, the creator of the ends of the earth, does not become weary or tired. His understanding is inscrutable. He gives strength to the weary. That sounds like it acknowledges the fact that we do grow weary. And yet God, what do we see here? Gives them strength, gives them what's necessary, right? And to him who lacks might, he increases power. Again, acknowledging that physically speaking, we struggle, but yet God gives what's necessary to make it through that day. Though youths grow weary and tired, and vigorous young men stumble badly, yet those, here's the key, yet those who wait for the Lord, or those who rest on God, will gain new strength. They will mount up with wings like eagles. They will run and not get tired. They will walk and not become weary. And again, this speaks to God's sustaining strength in the person that takes an absolute rest and trust in him and him alone. There's another couple texts that I want to take a look at too as it regards this. Another one is Matthew chapter 11, 28 to 30. Matthew chapter 11, 28 to 30. This text is a really good one that I've heard many times, but I think understanding the principle of what Jesus is saying here is also important. He says in Matthew 11, 28 to 30, the very famous verses that read, "Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest." By the way, in my Bible, I want that underlined. Why do I want that underlined? There's a promise here. If he says, "Come to me," that's an invite. And if I do come to him, and yes, I might be weary and heavy laden, he promises to give me rest. He promises to renew me. That's a blessing. Verse 29, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me." Wait a second. This whole yoke thing doesn't sound like rest. Well, let's keep going. We'll come back to that in just a second. "For I am gentle," he says, "and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Well, I think when we read that, we might think of it a little different than what Jesus meant it as. And so I want to give you a little background to this yoke scenario so you can understand the rest that comes from it. I mentioned this at church a few weeks ago, but this yoke was a double yoke. And so back in that day, you would yoke up two oxen together. But not just any two oxen. Most often, only took one oxen to really run a plow, if you will. But there are some reasons why you would put two up next to each other. The one that Jesus is talking about is very clear. This use of a yoke had to do with raising up of a young oxen. And that young oxen, one, doesn't know how to plow straight, and he zigzags a lot. And by the way, when you zigzag a lot to get the task done, it takes way more effort, right? And sometimes you have to go back over the same tracks that you were in before again and again and again to get it straight, right? So there's a lot more effort. It comes with a lot more struggle and pain. And farmers don't like crooked lines from what I'm aware of, right? And so that wasn't good that a young oxen wouldn't know how to go straight. But the other thing too is that a young oxen didn't have much power yet, and especially in and of themselves. And so for them to pull a plow, they would get very tired very quick if they were even able to do anything. And so for that reason, for them to go, not even just making zigzags and still doing anything, but rather they would get tired and maybe couldn't even perform the task. And so a farmer would take that young oxen that he'd like to have trained up to be mature one day, to be able to walk in straight rows, and to know what is called for of him. And secondly, to build up his strength so that he can indeed do the work. He would yoke him up to a very mature oxen that's well trained, that keeps straight pathways, has the strength to not just plow the row, but also to pull that young oxen along. And so here we see Jesus drawing the picture that he is the one that's the greater of the oxen, the mature oxen, if you will, that's going to show the way to the younger oxen. And he says, take my yoke, this yoke that's latched onto me, take it upon you. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to guide you in a straight path so it's efficient and effective, so that the work you're doing, you're not doubling back over 4, 5, 6, 7 times, right? Instead, it's going to be efficiently accomplished straight ahead, pressing straight forward towards the mark. That's a good thing. But then you have the other aspect of it too, about it being easy and not burdensome. Again, that young oxen can't take a ton of weight. They can't bear that type of a burden. But Christ, the greater oxen in this case, he can. And so he says, buckle up. I'm going to take you. I'm going to bear the weight. And while I'm bearing the weight, I'm going to also show you the way. And so in that way, when we find ourselves pursuing God and saying, God, I want to be yoked up to you. I need your strength. I need your guidance. Lord, if we find ourselves in that way before God, seeking out his strength and his reminders and his promises each day, finding our life aligned with Christ, what we're doing is we're taking on that yoke. And we're saying, okay, here I am to learn your way, and I know you're going to carry the weight, and you're going to show me the way. What we find is a yoke that's easy, and the burden is light. Where, if we're honest, the rest of life has a certain sort of weight. There's a certain other yoke that we can have on us if we're telling the truth. It's the standards of this world, the things that it demands of us, right? Or at least the things that we think it's demanding of us. And God is saying, this world tries to tie you down through rules and laws and regulations and standards and new philosophies and new ideas and everything else. And when you think about those things like you're the one that provides and carries them out on your own, yeah, you're going to have a burden, and it will not be light. And it will drag you down. It'll cause you to stumble. It'll cause you to go in different directions. And what should be accomplished won't be accomplished. This is why it's so important. This is why it's so important to find ourselves yoked up with God, yoked up with Christ, having him carry our burdens, having him pull us along, taking our weight and showing us the way. And I believe that that's what Psalm 73, what Asaph is talking about here. He's saying, my flesh is weak, my strength is little, but God's strength is not. And so I need to find myself tethered to God. Now the comparison or contrast comes in verse 27. For behold, those who are far from you will perish. You have destroyed all those who are unfaithful to you, meaning they don't trust you. God has a judgment for them. But now listen to verse 28. But as for me, the nearness of God is my good. So where others are scared to get near to God because he's going to demand a change in them, which is actually good for them, they look at it as evil, and in it, they're destroyed. But Asaph says here, for those that find God good and to be near to him as good, there's a certain blessing here. So he says, but as for me, the nearness of God is my good. I have made the Lord God my refuge, meaning the place that I rest, the place that I know I'm safe, well kept, guided well, that I may tell of all your works, meaning the work that God is doing, not me. Again, if we go back to that yoke analogy, who's carrying the weight? Who's providing the way, showing the way, leading the way, all these different things. Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 16, one of my favorite texts in Scripture, and again, it comes out of an invite. And I love this because it talks about Christ as our great high priest and the reason why we can go before God. In Hebrews chapter 4, verse 16, it says, therefore, and this therefore is because of Christ being at the right hand of God, interceding for us, and all that he's done in the gift of salvation, we now have an ability to go to God. We don't have to go through some pastor. We don't have to go through some priest. Okay, no one has to come to me as the pastor of the church and say, hey, would you talk to God on my behalf? They can go to God. If they know Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior, they can go directly to God. They don't need a priest. It says this in verse 16, therefore, let us draw near with confidence to the throne of grace. Who's at the throne of grace? God is. How do I know that? Let's listen. So that we may receive mercy. Who gives mercy? God does. And find grace. Who gives grace? God does. To help in time of need. The nearness of God, for those that have put their faith and trust in him, the nearness of God is not just a good thing, it is the best thing in the believer's life. And God has said, I've given you free access. Come to me, and don't just come to me in general. Come to me in confidence. Why? Because you're mine. The nearness of God is where you find the strength and grace and mercy of God. How close are you and how near are you to God today in your own personal walk? Have you found God to be the actual strength of your daily life? Do you go to him asking him to lead you in the proper way? Do you go to him and ask him to carry the burdens and to pull you along? That doesn't mean sitting still. There's a movement, right? Christ, when he yokes up with you, he pulls you along, but nonetheless, he's carrying the brunt of the weight. And he wants to do that for you today. The question is, will you let him? I pray that this psalm of Asaph, Psalm 73, verses 26 to 28, is an encouragement to you because God does want to carry your burdens. He does want to take your weight, and he does want to show you the way through the course of life, one step at a time. Will you let him do that? Thanks, and I'm praying for you.